Hey everybody, welcome to Inside the Trojans Huddle. We're doing part two this week, so we're going to talk defense. But because things move so fast this time of the year, we're also going to go back and hit some offensive things that happened since we recorded a few days ago. We're taping this on Thursday morning. By the time you see it, 37 guys will have entered the transfer portal, and USC will have an entirely new coaching staff. That being said, enjoy the ride. It's like what do they call it when they bury those artifacts in the ground and a time capsule? This is like a time capsule this time of year. Um, by the way, college football playoffs getting ready to start this week. If you want to go see Boise State win the national championship this year by running the table, and I know you do, you probably need to get tickets now. Go to the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app. If you put in on3, ON3, you get $20 off your first purchase. They're going to have tickets to all the games. You can watch that. You can watch the Irish lose this week to Indiana, but you better hurry because the game's Friday night, so you got to get going. You can watch Oregon fall on their faces, and yes, that is a prediction, but probably not their first game. You can watch all that on the Game Time app or GameTime.co on the laptop. Go do it. Good tickets, good prices. We all use the app individually, so give it a go. All right, guys, let's jump into this. We did our offensive discussion a couple days ago, and then all hell broke loose. So let's talk briefly about some of that. First, Josh Henson leaves. He is almost immediately replaced by Zach Hanson. I think primarily because that allows them only to change one letter on the door of the office, and that's a cost cut. When you have to pay a lot in NIL, you got to do stuff like that to
cut that pork. Cut that pork.
The Branch brothers jumped into the portal, and yesterday, Emmanuel Pranon announced that he is going to come back next year and play one more year at USC. I think those were the big events offensively. Yes, did I miss anything? Okay, let's start with Pranon, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it because I'm pretty sure the opinions are going to be unanimous. How do we feel about that?
Significantly a good move, huge move. You probably don't even look back and say, "Oh, we missed on Eugene Brooks," because you're bringing back somebody who's now going to be in your system for 3 years. You got that veteran presence right next to Elijah Page. You've solidified the left side of your offensive line, which is it's so important when you've got your blind side taken care of. You've got 3/5 of the offensive line now secure. We're going to assume Alani Noah is going to hold on to the right guard spot, and now just figure out that center and that the right tackle position. Emmanuel Prayon coming back is probably the most significant move that's taken place since the regular season ended. Everyone assumed he was going to the NFL, but when you can pay 1-year contracts now that are probably going to match or do better than what you're going to make in your first contract in the NFL, based on the NFL grade he got back, maybe that's advantageous now. Maybe you start using that as a recruiting tool.
Yeah, and he's a good example of a guy who played well last year, but can work on some things and raise his draft stock and probably make more money and find a better spot. He is a guy who's improved dramatically since he arrived, right? I mean, his early games, it's like, oh boy, you got this huge guy, and I don't think he knows what he's doing. By the end of the season this year, he was USC's best offensive lineman, and he's a guy who probably will be, this is a guy who has a chance to be an All-American this year if he shows the sort of improvement I would expect. Go ahead,
The way he approached the season, I mean, he came into camp looking like a new dude. I mean, he went through the BKU transformation. He dropped all that, call it baby fat, and he sculpted his body to like, that's a unit, that's a dude, first guy off the bus guy.
Yeah, he's an impressive dude physically. So yeah, it gives you a really strong left side of the offensive line. I think Page improved quite a bit this year, and I would expect a guy at his going from a second to third year, having another offseason, having those starts under his belt. Elijah Page is going to be a really good football player next year. Emmanuel Pranon is a really good football player. Having those two guys back Doesn't solve the offensive line worries that we had the other day, but boy, it helps a lot. Eric, thoughts on the change of the offensive line assistant coaching position?
It's an interesting one, and somebody asked on the message board, and I kind of said this is not going to probably be pleasant for fans to hear, where they want to hear it was a great move or it was a terrible move, right? You want to come down on one side. I think it was fine. I think it was fine. I think if Zach Hansen did what if you go back and look at what he did at Tulsa, the guys he coached, sort of the production there, if he had continued as an offensive line coach and sort of moved up maybe at a bigger school, or even stayed at Tulsa and had that kind of production, and this was sort of a new guy that was coming over, I think people would say, hey, he's produced some guys. He's a good offensive line coach. I think he's a good offensive line coach. And that's where he kind of tell, like, that's where his heart is. Like, that's the position he played very well at Kansas State, and that's the position that he's very comfortable coaching. I think that you had a chance this offseason, if you're Lincoln Riley, the way you brought in all new sort of fresh blood, fresh ideas on the defensive side last year. There's probably a reason to do that this year on offense. So in that regard, no, it's a guy that's coached with Riley a lot, who's not going to bring, I think, a ton of off the wall. Hey, we tried this last year, because he's been with Riley so often. So you're sort of doubling down a little bit on the Lincoln Riley offense with him. It bridges any sort of gap between is a important position to have that relationship with your coach at the offensive line. I mean, that's key. And so you jump past that hurdle, you jump past kind of getting a coach on board and, hey, this is how we do things here. So there's reasons to be excited about. I think this is going to work. I think he's a good coach. But yeah, that's a spot where you could have kind of gone outside the family, I guess, and brought something in and shaken up a little bit on offense. Again, we're still a long way away from the offseason ending, and so there could be other opportunities to do that as you go down, and especially without sort of accountable coach limit. You bring in whoever you want, work with anybody at this point.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to chalk it up to that's a lazy hire because he's down the hall and you wanted to just make a quick, action reaction type of thing. I think he's a good offensive line coach.
Yeah, look, the positives, my quick points on it, but the positives are you keep the continuity going. He's going to use the same schemes that these offensive linemen are used to, so you're not making the transition to a new style. And also, he's a really good recruiter. I mean, look at the tight end room. There's some talent in there, so you assume he's going to be able to do the same thing now on the offensive with the offensive linemen in that room as well. So, if the big criticism with Josh Henson was he couldn't snag that elite 5-star offensive lineman, maybe Zach Hansen, he's got the ear of USC's recruiting coordinator pretty well established. Maybe they can work well together there. You look at the positives, it's a solid hire, but again, less than 24 hours. Just from an optics point of view, you're thinking, did you put any research into it? Or was this your guy once Henson found out, 24, 36 hours earlier that he was going to Purdue?
And Zach Hansen talked after Wednesday's practice about how much he's worked with the offensive line / tight end / blocking scheme / whatever. So this may well have been a sort of offensive line coach in waiting, and we know we're going to go that way if Henson gets a deal, because Josh Henson had, right, he had to go call plays. If he wants to continue moving up and all of that, like, yeah, you can have the title offensive coordinator at USC. Nobody's fooled by that. No, there's no coach out there going, oh, that guy must be calling the plays for Lincoln Riley's offense. So it all fit for Josh Henson. He gets to go back small town in West Lafayette at Purdue and run an offense there. So again, it all sort of made sense in how everybody steps up in that room.
No,
Yeah.
he wants to be a head coach. He told somebody off the record who told me that I'm not getting. He goes, I'm not getting any younger. He wants to take that next step in his career, so that's why he took this position when his friend Barry Odom said, "Hey, let's get this done."
Yeah, certainly makes sense for him. And I, Hansen is not a big splash of a hire. He's not. This is not Coach Henney. It's not Matt Entz. It's not that kind of position coach hire. But he certainly has some experience. He's familiar with the system, and we'll see. My biggest my biggest criticism of Henson, although it's tempered with my knowledge that the NIL was terrible during the time, is that he may not have been a recruiter at the level of some of the other assistant coaches. So we'll see what Hanson could do. Um, we also had the Oklahoma kid who jumped in the portal. Apparently, is going to go to UCLA. According to Scott Schrader on our site, his response when hearing that Hanson was hired is, "Well, you should have told me yesterday." I hear that and I think of Adam Sandler's voice in The Wedding Singer. Um, look, if the kid wants to go to UCLA, he should go to UCLA. If he doesn't want to go to UCLA and would have been interested in USC had they called him a day earlier, that makes no sense at all. I mean, it's just silly. But whatever. I mean, USC is still going to have to add some people in transfer portal in the offensive line. They're going to have to find somebody who's starting caliber center, which is not to say that O'Connor can't do it, but there are question marks there, and they clearly need a right tackle. They have to have a right tackle, unless you think that you're going to get a huge jump from this year's backup. But he's still young, so in any event, that's that. I guess the last piece is USC lost one more member of that receiving room in Zach Branch. I think USC fans are of two opinions on this. Half of them are saying this is a tragedy. We keep losing 5 stars. What in the world is going on? The other half are saying he may have been a 5-star, but what did he do this year that you can't replace? And the reality is that Josiah Zamora probably could have given us the same production. That's not a shot at Josiah, who I've met. It's a nice kid. That's just saying that what you expected from Zachariah Branch didn't come close to coming to reality. What do you take from that? What I take from that is at some point, USC has to start getting production out of the most talented guys on its roster. If you were to make a list of the 6 or 7 most talented guys on the roster last year, Bear Alexander, Deuce Robinson, and Zachariah Branch would be on that list. And at some point, you can't say, well, he never produced, so what? At some point, the most talented guys need to start playing like the most talented guys, and in a healthy program, they would. And I'm worried about that. Zachariah Branch was better his first 2 games than he was his last 2 games at USC, and that's insane to me. Absolutely insane. When you saw him play at the beginning, he was so explosive, and he would put his foot down and go. That's not the same Zach Branch we saw this year, and I don't know who's responsible. Probably a bunch of people. Probably Zach himself. Probably Dennis Simmons. Probably Lincoln Riley's scheme and play calling. Probably the other wide receivers for not blocking very well on all those behind the line of scrimmage passes. I mean, there's probably a long list, but geez, at some point, you got to stop losing the most talented dudes on your roster, especially when you're a program that hasn't exactly been stacking up 5-star recruits over the last 5 years. So it's pretty frustrating, to me at least.
Go back to the first game of the season. His easiest reception that he could have walked in for a touchdown. It was almost like it was a precursor of what was to come for Zachariah this year, to the point where he got benched on kickoff return. And I think they left him in there at punt return just to kind of, save a little bit of his honor. But even then, even at punt return, he's waving for fair catches with 10, 15, 20 yards of cushion in front of him. It was really weird to watch the effort that he was putting in this year.
It was hard to watch, and most of the guys that transfer out of USC and go to other schools, you don't really hear from them again. That's been the case most of the time. I have a feeling with Deuce and Zach that may not be the case. I have a feeling that somebody's going to get those guys turned around. They're just so unbelievably talented, and if those guys are putting up 1,400 receiving yards next year, I'm going to be very, very disappointed that USC couldn't figure out how to use them. Anyway, Anything else on the offense before we move on to the defense? Okay. I mean, I want to pretend like defense matters at USC. These days I'm told it does. Okay, let's do this. Let's start with, what do we feel good about? Just based on the current roster right now, what do we feel good about going into 2025? Eric, why don't you start us off there?
I feel good about Danton Lynn leading things. That's where I feel the best. I feel like that guy is going to Iron Chef his way to something, right? Whatever you lift up, whatever ingredients you give me, I'm gonna make something with it. And I think there's something to that with Dan Lynn. Now, looking at the players on the roster, honestly, not a ton where I say that's a guarantee. That's a guarantee on defense. If Eric Gentry comes back, again, we have to say if on literally everybody. I mean, they're coaches, players, everything, college football in general. So if you have him at linebacker, I think things clicked with him. And I know he had a great relationship with Matt Entz and how he used him and all of that. Dan Lynn's the guy calling plays and kind of setting him up and doing that sort of stuff. That clicked. I think that Eric Gentry next year could be big time. So I'm going to start with him. And I think that I like a lot of the freshmen who then have to take a jump. But again, it's ifs everywhere. I think you could get a lot out of Desmond Stevens. I think you could get a lot out of Elijah Newby. Cam Fountain, we saw this year, take steps forward. I think there's something there. I like the two corners, Marcellus Williams and Braylon Conley. Do I know that those guys are going to be good? No. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing with the defense right now. I mean, you just can't, what we got from Anthony Lucas when he was healthy, I think was good, but maybe still not quite what you hear about him. And then Braylon Shelby, same thing. I think good, but not to the point where everyone's going, holy cow, what do we do about that guy? So there's not, I feel good about the direction. I feel good about sort of what the whole pie is going to look like next year. But yeah, as far as there being, this guy, that guy, that guy, that guy, there's not a lot you can point to where you can say you're definitely going to get, potential all Big Ten, all America potential or production out of those guys. And I guess the if Kamari Ramsey, I guess, is still kind of that if does he go, that changes maybe not as much as Emmanuel Pregnon on offense, but a lot. I mean, coming back, if you have him in the secondary, changes a lot about how you feel about the defense in terms of those individual guys.
What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think Eric touched on the right points. You start up front, the defensive line, you've got some really good young players. So you've got Braylon Shelby, who was pressed for whatever reason after practice yesterday, but he's coming back. You've got Cameron Fountain. You've got Anthony Lucas, which I think no news is good news. If you're not hearing anything about him, I think we can assume that he'll be back next year as well. Danton Lynn is still the conductor. If Kamari Ramsey comes back, that's huge. But there's just the best part about it is you got a lot of young players. Defensive line looks like it could be good if Henny and Nua now actually start developing these guys. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. If they don't get anybody out of the transfer portal on the interior to get that push up the middle, I don't care how good of a coordinator Lynn is. I don't care how good your defensive backs are. If the opposing quarterback knows that he doesn't have to move to the left or the right and feel the pass rush, it doesn't matter how many good players you're bringing in at defensive end, at linebacker, at defensive back. You got to get that Jakeem Stewart. You got to get someone right next to him inside to push that offensive line back into the quarterback's face. Then I'll feel great about the defense.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I'm terrified by the linebacker room right now because the young guys you mentioned are probably going to be good players. They just, I mean, Newbie didn't play, and Desmond Stevens was playing 5, 6, 7 plays a game most of the time. So those guys just haven't played, and linebacker is a position where reps help. That's why he kept playing the older guys because he trusted them because he figured they knew what they were doing. Didn't trust the young guys. But the truth is, the young guys now didn't get a lot of experience, and so I don't know how you can trust them this year either. I think they should have gotten more reps, especially because the line. It's not like the linebacker play was. It's not like you're taking Chris Claiborne out or Junior Seau out. I mean, the linebackers played hard and they had some good games, but they weren't. They weren't all Americans. You can afford to take those guys out from time to time, but he didn't. Um, Eric Gentry is a playmaker and a stud. We don't know how many games he'll play. Every game Eric Gentry plays in, he is going to make a difference. But will that be 4 games, 10 games? I mean, it's never been 12 that I know of. So um, having him back is huge, but having him actually be able to play for a full year would be enormous because if he does, he's a first team all conference caliber player. And so that matters. If Kamari Ramsey comes back, I actually feel pretty good about the secondary. I know there are young guys all around him, but having a leader at that position is important. And some of those young guys, I think, are probably more talented than the older guys that we lost. I think they'll be all right there. Although, they did pull in an experienced corner from San Jose State, so that's probably one of your starters, and they'll probably pull in some other guys. Defensive line, it's interesting because you don't have a lot there that's proven. But you have bodies in that room now that look different than the bodies 2 or 3 years ago. We, you know, I had complained a couple of times recently that when Riley shows up, he's got a depleted Clay Helton roster, and everybody recognizes he has to fix it. And you fast forward 3 years, and he's got a depleted Clay Helton roster, except at defensive line. He's got a bunch of young. He's got a bunch of young and unproven guys at defensive line, but the bodies in that room are impressive. And it may be, well, I think he's going to go and try to find I think Lynn is probably going to try to find a legit nose tackle who can plug up those A gaps, some 335-pound guy that you can't move. And I hope he gets him. It's also the case that you got 3 really big bodies in last year's recruiting class and talented kids that by year 2 may very well be in a position where they can do some things. Cameron Fountain is going to be a very good player. Braylon Shelby, I don't know what to make of. Maybe Braylon Shelby is a guy who should be 25 pounds heavier playing inside. I don't know. Jakeem Stewart, we don't know, but we know this. The USC coaches think he's going to be a difference maker. They offered him a huge amount of money and recruited him like crazy. And even now they're talking about how far advanced he is, not just with his physical skills, but with his technique. This is a guy who I think they expect will come in and get 8 or 10 sacks. And if he does, that makes a pretty big difference. Anthony Lucas is a guy who was starting to develop more as a run stopper than as a pass rusher. But as a run stopper, he was fantastic when he was in there. So, I mean, you look at the guys they have in that room and you say, these are guys that Henne and Nua should be able to develop into a quality group. And it wouldn't surprise me if the best group on the defensive side of the ball next year is the defensive line. I think they have a chance to be really good. Okay, let's talk about the question marks. Obviously, one of the question marks everywhere is who's going to stay, right? I don't know if Kamari Ramsey's coming back. I think he can probably improve his draft stock if he does. Fantastic coverage guy already. I think he can improve his physicality this year and really make himself a very high draft choice, but he may go high anyway. So we always have that. We talked about some of the other question marks. I guess who are the guys who you'd point to and say, if these guys can develop the way I hope they can, it makes a huge difference for us? Give me some of those names. We may have already mentioned them, but let's look at it through that lens. Who are the guys you're looking at? Say, I don't know what we'll get from them, but if we get what I think they're capable of, that will make a huge difference for this team.
Front seven guys for me. Front seven, right? Four guys right in the middle. I mentioned two. Desmond Stevens, right, taking a big step. Elijah Newby, if he can play that will spot at linebacker. I don't think, based on what we saw, I don't think Danton Lynn is going, hey, a sophomore and a redshirt freshman, yeah, take all our snaps at inside linebacker. Like right, Gentry's going to play. They're going to find someone who's got some experience and going to play there. But right in front of them, Jade Abasiri, Carlon Jones. Again, you don't want to ask a ton of just second-year guys right in the middle of your line. Those are two big recruits, and Carlon dealt with injuries all year, and you got to, you want to shake that, because you've seen in the past, if those hang with you and you don't see the field, then you're not here for long. I mean, that's kind of how things go. So you want to see him shake that, get on the field in the spring. Jade showed enough flashes. And is he an interior guy? Is he an edge guy? The body, you've seen some of those things. Devin Tompkins, kind of the same thing, but they're finding homes for those guys up there. I think if those two specifically take big jumps this offseason, I'm just talking about young guys here, it makes you feel different about that group. We're not passing over. You got to add a huge guy, right? Dan Lynn talked about, we need size in the front seven. Well, looking for size. The defensive tackles they've tripped in from the transfer portal, gigantic guys. They clearly want to add that. But getting a step forward from those guys, your interior defensive line, okay, that feels different. That feels one of, you talk about sending guys in waves and being able to just kind of rotate and throw, body after body at offensive lines. Those two would help.
It's interesting you mentioned, I don't know if he's an interior guy, if he's the edge. USC has a ton of guys who are hand in the dirt edge guys. A ton of them. I think that's what Jakeem Stewart is. He might be able to play defensive tackle. That's what Lucas is, although he might be able to play defensive tackle, right? You have a lot of guys who are 280 pounds or so, who are probably traditional 4-3 defensive ends. You don't have a lot of 250-pound speed rushers off the edge. And you don't have 340-pound guys who are just space eaters on the inside. Lynn might be okay with that. I think he wants a space eater, but he might be okay with that. I mean, he talks about guys that you can move around. And I think Lynn looks at these guys as guys that you can play at a 3 technique, you can play at a 5 technique, you can move them around and they can do various things. But when it comes to guys who look the part of a hand in the dirt traditional 4-3 defensive end, USC's got a bunch of them. They need to play, right? They need to show it, but they've got a bunch of them with just immense talent. So hopefully hopefully that will matter. Mark, you have anybody else defensive side who you think huge potential, if they can do what they're capable of, it'll make a big difference?
Well, you guys are talking about the front seven, and I touched on this a little bit earlier. If you want the guys on the back end to be good, you need those guys up front to do their job. So, look, we're replacing USC's starting secondary essentially this year, especially if Kamari Ramsey leaves town. And I think he's just waiting on his NFL draft grade to make the decision. So, assuming that, now you've got Braylon Connolly and Marcellus Williams that we've talked about. One of those two is going to get a starter's job, possibly both of them. But behind them now, who are their backups? Who are going to be the starting 4 cornerbacks? What are we going to get out of Malachi Crawford? Isaiah Rubin, is he ready to take that next step? Because it's a young secondary. So I think that's why it's going to be so important that, they can convince Kamari, hey, you know what? Let's give you your NFL money here for 1 year and just improve your draft stock. Because I don't care how good you are up front. You need guys who can cover in the back. And we're going to see how good Doug Belk is, because you saw a lot of improvement with USC secondary last year. Now he's going to be using some young guys. He's not going to have a Jalen Smith or a John Humphrey or Jacoby Covington, or guys who've got a lot of games under their belt to fall back on. He's now
Of
got,
those, of those guys, though, like Jalen Smith is a guy you look at and you say he's going to be tough to replace this year because he played so well. I wouldn't have said that the year before, and so I think Belk made huge progress with him. The other two guys are good players, and I wish them the best. They're replaceable guys, right? I mean, I think you can find. I think you've already replaced one of them with the San Jose State transfer, and I think Marcellus Williams probably can step in. Secondary is not like defensive line. You do not have to throw waves of bodies at people. You can get injuries in the secondary, but even then, you're less likely to get injuries there than you are at defensive tackle, for example. Just less physical. So if you can avoid injuries, you can have three corners and make it through the year just fine because they don't have to come off the field. There's no reason a corner has to come off the field unless you're just trying to get somebody behind him some reps. Yeah, okay. Those are all good. Now let's talk. Oh,
Christian Pierce. Throwing him out. He could be right. That guy's in line to start. I mean, right? Zion Branch was in that mix too, with him going to the portal. You need Achille Arnold was a solid vet, never complete blown coverages, but athletically and like, can you make big time plays? I feel like not what he brought to USC. Christian Pierce, athletically, the way he runs, the way he goes after the ball, like he has a chance to really step up and potentially elevate that spot. But again, another position where you just went with the vet all the time, the experienced guy. And you talked about, can you play the young guys, and does that, especially when you're, once you're not playing for a playoff bid anymore, then it becomes like, hey, let's throw those guys out there. I know it sounds dumb because I sat here at the very beginning and said whatever Dan Lin wants to do is great. But that was one of those things during the year where it's, a series here, a series there, like let those guys get a couple snaps. Although I understand now, I mean, we kind of what we talked about with Emmanuel Perignon, right? The piece, Eugene Brooks, the piece that could be here for 3-4 years, whatever it is. No, the one guy, the 1 year. Set your roster up for right now, 1 year. That's all it is. So you understand, like, whatever 25, 26, 27 seasons are, no, we're playing 1 year at a time, and that's how you have to approach things.
There was an interesting interview with Deion Sanders the other day where he was talking about his recruiting strategy. He was talking about he'll recruit freshmen, but not that many. If he recruits a freshman, it's got to be a guy that he expects can play this year because you're not going to retain people. And you've seen that with USC where you have young guys who don't play a ton, but you think they can in the future. They just disappear. Or a guy like Tacky Curtis, who was not ready to play and didn't play particularly well, but the coaches were so invested in his future that they throw him out there over and over and over again, and he just bails. I mean, at this point, if you're a coach, it's hard to look at it and say, in this age of unrestricted free agency, no long-term contracts, agents running around promising everybody that they're going to get twice as much money as they leave, don't tell me to build for 2 years from now. Those guys will all be gone. It makes it very difficult, but that's a bigger problem, and it's not a USC problem. That's an everybody problem. It also means that almost no school is going to have the depth they used to have. Back in the heyday where Pete Carroll and Urban Meyer were killing it, those guys had high 4-star, 5-star guys, third string, just waiting for a chance to play, playing special teams, playing in blowout games. That doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist at Georgia. It doesn't exist at Ohio State. Because for the most part, those guys aren't willing to sit around and wait for a few years. They can leave now, get more money from somebody else, play right away. And that's way more appealing than sitting on your bench for 3 years. So depth in college football has been devastated nationwide. It's just the way it is. Which also, and Eric, you pointed this out, it means that there are a lot more teams that have good players on their rosters than there used to be. Maybe not. Most of those teams don't have a good player everywhere like Ohio State does, but they've got some guys on their team that they never would have had 10 years ago, because the talent gets spread out when the money gets spread out, and that means that you're likely to be in a position where you see a lot more upsets in college football now than you did before. In fact, you probably did. I mean, Georgia lost 2 games; they could have lost 4, right? And that's a team that's recruited better than anybody over the last 5 years. But all of a sudden, you see them out there against Kentucky, and Kentucky's completely dominating Georgia's offense. Like, holy smokes, we live in a different age. So Georgia still didn't lose 6 games. Okay, so let's talk about what USC absolutely has to have in the transfer portal. And we go into this knowing that last year we said these are the things that USC absolutely has to have. The USC coaches are saying these are things they absolutely have to have, and they did not get them. So just because they're saying it doesn't mean it's going to happen. But let's talk about what they absolutely have to have defensively. Mark, start us off.
Defensive tackle, defensive tackle, defensive tackle, middle linebacker.
You want 3 defensive tackles, or are you just trying to stress the importance of defensive?
Yes and yes. Look, I mentioned it earlier. You guys talked about it. You've got the guys on the end now. You've got guys who look like they're 4-3, put your hand in the dirt, go sniff out the ball, go get it type of guys. But when the quarterback drops back to pass, you want to move him off his mark. And if you're not getting that push up the middle, that's going to create a problem. It's creating a longer, from point A to point B, that line just got longer. So if you want a Braylon Shelby or an Anthony Lucas or whomever's on the other side of the line to get to the quarterback, make it a shorter distance. Make the quarterback have to move his feet one way or the other. Gavin Meyer, Kobe Pepe, Elijah Hughes, the guys who played last year, they did a commendable job, but they weren't the guys that USC necessarily wanted in the beginning. They wanted impact guys, the guy that went up to Oregon, the Derek Harmon. So that's why they're looking and hopefully investing really heavily this offseason in the transfer portal to get those guys, to make the guys they already have on the roster that much better.
Yeah, and they're probably not going to find a Mike Patterson or a Cedric Ellis, right? You're not going to find a guy who is constantly living in the backfield because you can't block him. I don't think that guy exists in the transfer portal. What you can find is a guy who's 40 pounds bigger than Mike Patterson who you can't move. That you can find, and that probably helps in the pass game, but it helps more in the run game. If there's no space in those A gaps, that is hugely helpful. And those guys are out there, and they're looking for them, and those guys are expensive. I mean, we talked last year about Harmon and his asking price, and is it worth it? And you look back on the season now, and the conclusion you reach is, yeah, it was worth it. That was a good investment by Uncle Phil. That guy made a big, big difference. And Oregon's defense looks different if they don't have those 2 portal defensive tackles. It's just the case. Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, right. So Keyshawn Silver from Kentucky, David Blay from Louisiana Tech, Jamal Jarrett from Georgia. I think those are the 3. One of them. If you're going to go, sure, I'm setting baseline here. If you're going to bring them in, if you're going to make them seem like these are the guys, we're going all out for 1, 2, 3, however many of these guys, you can't come up empty. Because you're slow out of the gate. It feels like you're slow out of the gate. I mean, when guys go in, they're done. They're set. And that DJ Harvey was that. I mean, he went in, but this is a San Jose State cornerback coming back to Southern California. This is not ripping away the best wide receiver in the country or best edge rusher or whatever from some SEC team. So you're slow in, and also it's been interesting. Lincoln Riley talked about sort of the the market that you think is there in September, when it actually materializes in December, it can move all over. I don't know if it always feels like USC has that right pulse at every single spot. Now, I know they've got a number, right? A percentage of whatever we're going to spend here and here and here. We're not going to spend 90% of our budget on wide receivers. And I understand that. But these guys, there are guys that will go get that number somewhere else. And so if USC is going to say we need big guys, we want to go in on the defensive front, you got to do it. You can't then balk and say, well, nobody was in our asking range. We let them all go to other places. Can't do it. You got to find who's going to fit the best, who's going to give you the best production, and go on that. So yeah, I think in the middle of that defensive line, you need a guy who not can get to the quarterback. I think you need a guy who has gotten to the quarterback. There's a difference in, oh, I like sort of what he can do, and maybe he can use these traits to this and that. No, there's guys that get to the quarterback and have that extra whatever to do that. I think you need that guy to bring him in. Whatever he plays. If he's a linebacker, if he's an inside linebacker that you have to blitz, if he's an edge guy, if he is more of a 3 tech or whatever, get someone on there who has gotten to the quarterback before. And then the secondary is interesting. I mean, it's all interesting. I had mentioned two of my favorite guys to look at were second-year players that you need to jump from. You're bringing two big veteran defensive tackles and say, oh, by the way, they're getting all your snaps this year, and then still try to hang on to those guys. Like that's the juggle when you have these young guys coming up where you don't know what they can produce. Who are you all in on saying, yeah, we're going to give that guy a bunch of snaps and we're going to see how it goes? You haven't even seen these guys in spring ball yet to see what that offseason even sort of starts to look like. So that's going to be a balance in the secondary too, because you've got, Marquise Gallegos is back there, and Jarvis Boatwright, and like you've got young names that we haven't even mentioned, and you'd love to hang on to them. You'd love to. But experience, and Danton Lynn talked about that too. We don't want just older guys. We don't want just talent. We want talented veterans who have played, because that's what we're losing. That's going to be an interesting balance, because I think you need those guys at all three levels. The balance of bringing those in and keeping your guys, because right now there's not a young defensive guy that I would say, oh yeah, get him out of here. Like I want to see all these guys. I think there's a ton coming in too as true freshmen, where you say, boy, that guy could really turn into something. But no, in terms of replacing tackles at this level, sacks at this level, pass deflections, snaps taken, all of that, you need, I think, a couple guys at every level defensively.
I think we're gonna get a really good view, a good sample size of the secondary in the bowl game. The young guys, the Marquise Gallegos, the Jarvis Boatwright Juniors, the Braylon Connollys, the Marcellus Williams, the Malachi Crawfords, the Christian Pierces. Hell, start them, let them play. If you played last year and you were a veteran, unless your name was Prophet Brown, look, get the young guys out there and let Prophet be the veteran senior leader.
Yeah, and you're talking about an opponent who, some of their best players may not play, but that's a program that recruits very, very well. And so the young guys they bring off the bench are going to be talented guys. So you'll learn something. It's not like you're playing a bottom feeder in the bowl game. You're playing a program that recruits at a very high level. So you're right. We'll learn something. And Eric's right that there's a difference between saying, I think this guy can do some things. I think he can get to the passer, and someone who's proven to do it. Because we went through this last year with the edge guys, talking about how I like the talent in that room. We need to see somebody actually break out, but I think somebody will. Nobody did. I mean, Cam Fountain played well at the end of the year. He wasn't terrorizing people, but he played well, and you think that that's a guy who's probably going to continue to develop. But other than that, it was Anthony Lucas played well until he went down. Braylon Shelby, I think you'd have to say, had a disappointing second season. I think that's a guy who who probably everybody expected would be a real threat to get to the passer. He wasn't. Doesn't mean he won't become that, but he wasn't. So, yeah, you don't want to look at it second year in a row and say, yeah, I think we have a lot of good bodies there. I really hope one of them will get to the passer because in this age of college football, you have to be able to get to the passer. You have to. And then we have the tackle spot. I mean, defensive tackle and pass rusher, whether that's edge or interior guy, those are expensive positions. USC is not going after a quarterback this year. It doesn't appear. So you're not going after the most expensive position, but those two are very expensive. And and you're talking about a right tackle, maybe not as expensive as a left tackle, but still there aren't a lot of high quality tackles in the portal. And
The right tackle, sorry, I don't mean to jump in over. The right tackle is interesting because a lot of these tackles that go in, what they're thinking is, I got to go play left tackle. I got to go play left tackle somewhere, and that's a huge difference. That's a huge difference when you see a tackle go in the portal. USC does not need a guy to show up here going, I'm going to play left tackle. I'm going to play left tackle. But the better guys in there, that's what they are. So it's a very specific. You can't just sort the tackle list and go, we'll take the top guy or the second guy or the third guy. Like that becomes a different conversation with guys that go in.
yeah,
Isaiah World is off the board. I can let you know that right now.
Oregon's taken two. Oregon's taken two from school, right? From Nevada and from Texas State, where if USC brings those guys in, the fans are, those are the guys we're taking. But yeah, you can find guys at those programs.
Look, you look at NFL rosters. NFL rosters has all kinds of guys from schools that are never on TV, and there are a lot of really good players at those programs. I mean, they're not loaded with them, but it's not unusual for NFL players to be at a small school. Yeah, so they're going to have a right tackle. They have to. You can't go into next season and hope that the young guys are going to be able to play that spot. If you find a right tackle and you find a center, all of a sudden you're looking really, really good on the offensive line. But those are two gigantic ifs. Gigantic ifs. So, okay. What else should we talk about defensively, guys, before we wrap this up? Is there anything we forgot to mention?
Each of you give me two guys who will be the surprise. Whoa, he came out of left field, and look, he's playing a lot this year. You don't have to give me you don't have to quote Bible and verse. Just give me two guys.
Con? On the defense.
On defense.
Well, I think we've already mentioned some of these guys, but I'll say that I expect that if Carlin Jones is healthy, he's going to be a major part of the rotation. That's a big kid that Ohio State wanted pretty badly. And Ohio State knows defensive linemen and recruits them very, very well. If you win a recruiting battle against those guys and that position coach for a defensive lineman, you probably got a good football player. The other one is not a surprise to anybody, really, but Jakeem Stewart is going to play a bunch this year. That guy doesn't sit on the bench. He does not, for all kinds of reasons. One, he's a physical freak. Two, he's getting paid a lot of money. And three, the really elite edge rushers are elite edge rushers from day one. Go back and look at the guys in the prior recruiting classes that were elite edge rushers, and you'll see that they're sitting there around 8-10 sacks as a true freshman. That is sort of the number. So Jakeem Stewart is going to play a bunch, and I suspect he'll make some mistakes. But I also expect that he's going to flash some true greatness because a coaching staff doesn't do what USC did to land that guy unless you're convinced that he can do that. And I trust these defensive coaches and their talent evaluation skills. So those are my two. Although I don't know if either one of them is a huge surprise.
I'm going to go Marquise Gallegos, and I'm going to pick a guy for the defensive tackle position. I think he's got the right body size. I think he has the right tenacity. And you never hear the name come out, so this is why it's a surprise. Rachimana Bulabalavu. Why not?
The third of last year's three big dudes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Eric?
Yeah, I'm gonna I think Marcellus Williams is phenomenal. We've talked about Marcellus a lot. I think Braylon Conley. Look, the buzz that he got early. He was not a spring enrollee, and right at the beginning of fall, kind of towards there, it was, hey, Braylon Conley showed up. I mean, that this guy is good, and that was just an impossible depth chart for the freshman to really crack when you had that what that looked like at corner last year. I think Braylon Conley can play. I think with both of those, right? If we plug DJ Harvey in at one, now you've got two, right? You've got that nickel spot, you've got that outside corner, and Lynn said that both Williams and Conley were going to work at both those spots. I think Conley has a chance to stick. And then I'm with Mark. I'm going on the defensive line, and I'm going off the board a little bit as a throw in. I think in this last class, Lorenzo Cowan
Yeah.
on the edge. So he was a guy that showed up, and the first time you saw him, it was like that guy looks like a safety. And then when you saw him after summer, he still you still knew he wasn't going to play this year.
But
And so we didn't talk about him a whole lot. But of the guys that made that offseason jump physically, he belonged in that conversation. So again, another year, and I'll take like the athleticism and potential pass rush there, because they got to find it. They got to find it. And so now that you're not a rookie anymore, now that you're technically a vet by, I mean, game 8, really, game 9, if you've been practicing that much, all bets are off in terms of who can be that guy. And so he's a spring ball guy that I'm interested to see a little bit and see how things are going there.
Okay, well, fellas, there we have it. The defense and the transfer portal. By the time this goes up, every single guy in the roster will be gone, and they'll be replaced by people we never heard of. So we'll have to do this all over. Literally, we have to have a live show that's 24/7 just to keep up. Okay, well, there you have it. Listen, thanks everybody for joining us. We will see you again next week. I don't know what we're going to talk about, but I'm guessing we'll have plenty in the transfer portal to talk about. Hopefully, we won't have too many more coaching changes to talk about, but this is coaching change season.
We
So
gotta
you
have
can-
a full breakdown of Texas A&M's 3 deep and all of their walk-ons that are going to be starting, and whatever their transfer portal-ish team looks like.
We're not going to do that, but we are going to spend 30 minutes analyzing the guys in the overalls who do that egg cheer. We're going to do that just for fun. All right, well, that's it. We're done here. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week. Till then, fight on.